Hello, and welcome to the Project Good podcast. I'm your host, Anne-Marie Hilton. Project Good is a social impact podcast interviewing experts and advocates about the pressing problems that we face globally and hearing how they suggest we move forward in the future. The Project Good podcast is brought to you by Project Good Work. The goal of this podcast is to inspire people and organizations to develop a mindset that can move others to positive action regarding the complex social issues facing people and the planet. For January, we're focusing on the topic of leadership in a remote world. Today, I have the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Henry Cooper, who is a business professor at Grand Canyon University in Arizona and an online professor for Centura College in Virginia. Dr. Cooper's courses and research focus on business management and operations, strategic management, and leadership and organizational development. In addition, Dr. Cooper has been a business consultant for almost 19 years, helping healthcare service providers give better service to patients by having more strategic plans and systems in place. His most recent publication, LMX Quality, Organizational Commitment, and RN Turnover Intention, a correlation examination of leadership exchange influence, looks at the role leadership plays in employee retention. Let's get into the interview. First, let me introduce our guest, Dr. Henry Cooper, who is the founder of the Leadership Matters More, a consulting business that helps to reshape the workplace culture. He advises organizations and its leaders on how to create a motivating, engaging, and knowledge-retaining workplace and workforce. As an expert in organizational development, Dr. Cooper also shares his knowledge as a business professor at Grand Canyon University in Arizona and as an online professor for Centura College in Virginia. Dr. Cooper's courses and research focus on business management and operations, strategic management, leadership, and organizational development. At the core, Dr. Cooper believes that leaders make or break organizations and employees. Welcome, Dr. Cooper.
Thank you, Anne. How are you?
Great. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well.
So I always like to ask someone why they started doing what they were doing. So what inspired you to study leadership?
Moving from the normal workplace environment as an operating room scrub technician to a leadership role at a hospital in San Diego, California, I found myself immersed in an environment that I was only trained for from a military standpoint. The leadership structure in the military is firm, it's in place, and it's operational. It is not, however, flexible, meaning that transferring that knowledge from the military to the private workforce becomes a bit problematic. So as I worked my way through different leadership positions, in various organizations, I found that there were disconnects between leaders, followers, and the organizational goals that those companies wanted to achieve. So I set myself to study as much as I could, perform research as much as I could, and I continue to do so. And that's what led me to be where I am today, looking at leadership in a way that I can help people to understand how they can make their operations and their businesses function better.
Oh, that's an interesting path that you took to go from a very, I would say, structured organization, the military, and then to utilize everything that you saw and start to take it into, the civilian world.
I think so. I think it was it was foundational for me. Let's put it that way. I think that having the military as a backdrop, I could see where structure was needed, and I could also see where adaptability was needed. So the transference from military to civilian actually demonstrated that there is a large amount of adaptability required in leadership, and it doesn't matter at that point whether you're in the civilian or in the military world.
So now that you've become an expert, one of the things I was reading as I was preparing for the interview, a little bit about you. I know sometimes people are like, oh, like you found out this about me. That you have, obviously you're telling me now that your background is that you were working already in the healthcare field from the military, and I'm going to assume that you liked it, and so that's why it has led you, as I was researching for almost 19 years now, that you are most of the businesses that you consult are dealing with healthcare or pharmaceutical. And so I guess in that, in our topic today, especially during these times of COVID, and I know that just from even it's an outsider perspective from the healthcare, I know that they aren't doing as remote, because doctors and nurses and things, tend to have to be in the hospital. So but with the rise of this health crisis, I'm sure that you are facing an interesting time, as I'm sure a lot of doctors and nurses are trying to figure out how can they make their jobs remote as well, just because of everything happening.
Absolutely. I think that there are some misconceptions related to healthcare and healthcare leadership. Healthcare leadership is really comprised of individuals who are not engaged in the clinical environment necessarily. Now, there are many clinical performers who also act in an administrative role, but those administrative and staff positions are positions that have changed and morphed into more of a remote environment. There are many physicians and physician practitioners who are moving to platforms like telehealth. I won't name any so that I'm not advocating for any particular brand, but telehealth is a field that is rapidly growing and bringing physicians and nurses on board so that they can actually deliver care to patients without physically touching them. That also opens a larger world to those patients who don't have access to great clinical care. There are specific instances where telehealth will not work, but in most senses it does.
Which is fantastic during these times, especially. And that kind of leads us into our larger discussion that we're looking about leadership in a remote world. Before we jump in a little bit deeper, obviously everybody has experienced the pandemic, but one of the things that people might not have been privy to is that since 2019, the number of people who are working from home has actually risen by 159%. So remote work and people starting to not work from an office was already on an uprise before we even entered this crisis. And another interesting tidbit I found as I was researching is that globally, actually, that it was a smaller percentage than I thought, but it was still a good percent. 16% of companies are globally are fully remote, so they never had offices. And that, and now with COVID, and this number, of course, might not be current today, as things literally, as we know, change daily on the front, but 58.6% of workers are doing remote work due to the COVID crisis. And it's expected by 2028 that 73% of all departments are expected to have remote workers. And the reason that I bring up these stats is that a lot of people keep trying to say that they want to go back to the way it was, like, can't we go back to normal before the pandemic? But these statistics were already in place even before remote work became the hot topic of 2020 and 2021. That we were already moving away from what was considered the normal that we knew to a new normal due to technology and just society was changing. The pandemic just brought it to the forefront. And so my first question to you then is that because of this, one of the things that is a hot topic that I see on the news right now is the people talk about the Great Resignation and change in the workforce. Do you think that one of the big things is because people don't understand that these changes were already happening?
I do, and I'd like to add that your statistics mirror mine. 70% of the workforce would like to or would prefer working from home. However, I don't know how much that affects the Big Quit or the Great Resignation. It has many labels. But one of the things that I will say about that is that those numbers were rising, as you stated, prior to the pandemic. The problem that we see is that many people are looking at opportunities to change employers because there is a need. So the bigger question is, why is there a need? So to get to why there is a Great Resignation or a Big Quit, we need to dig deeper and find out, why is there a need? Well, if you take a look at what the Pew Research Center tells us in their research, employers have looked for profit. They've looked for that profit at the expense of the employee. Once you begin to show your true colors to employees and they have an opportunity to leave, they will. This lines up with my research that I performed for my doctoral study. And I think that it's very difficult to convince people to come back to work or come back to the new normal, when in fact we're asking them to come back at the same rate of pay that they had. Well, there is a good chance that there is another employer out there who's trying to offer them more. And it's that conundrum that keeps us in this cycle of people being employed, people leaving employment, and seeking new employment. In other words, going to the highest bidder. There is a place where that will stop. And where that will stop won't necessarily be our new normal, but it will establish some guidelines for how employers will treat and need to treat employees moving into the future. Well,
how would you say that employers and companies can now attract top employees?
Well, one of the ways that that I engage my clients is I try to get them to understand that engaging employees is even more important than paying high salaries. An employee who is engaged, an employee who buys into the company is much more likely to remain, even if financial remuneration is even or equal. In other words, they may not be getting paid more, but they're bought into the mission of the organization. So employee engagement, especially employee engagement with the leadership team, with the executive team, with the strategic design that the organization has in place, that engagement is what will change what the new normal becomes.
Now, do you think that that actually people's values changed because of the pandemic, or do you think that the values were they the same? It just became, heightened, or?
Well, I hear your question, and I will say that it's always difficult to speak on the values of another person. But
Mm-hmm.
what the data tells us, what the data actually says is that the pandemic has created, it's created a new atmosphere. So that atmosphere leaves employees in a very emotive state. That state can affect someone's decision making, and it can also affect their value to the organization. So we're speaking of values in two senses here. One sense is the value of the employee to the employer, and the value of the employer to the employee. There is a rising social consciousness, as we all know, and it is playing a very vital role in change throughout the world. The way that we look at social issues, the way that we look at the social consciousness, the things that are happening in our society on an almost day-to-day basis, those things are the values that we kind of talk about, but we don't really know without speaking to an individual how that affects his or her choices when it comes to work. Economic inequality is one of the largest indicators of how employers lack value from their employees. And the decisions that are made in the Big Quit and the Big Resignation are the answer that employees give to employers based on that economic inequality.
Now, you brought up the fact that there's going to be a sense of like a give and take both from employees and employers in regards to what is required of both of them. I guess, can you elaborate, I guess, from both sides of what will be required of employees in the future in this new, remote type of work situation, or, where we're heading for the future of work? And also from the aspect of what would be required from employers.
Well, that's a very interesting question, and one that I am currently researching actually for a new piece. Employees want and require certain things. And some of those things happen to be things that have been desirable for quite some time. Of course, they want to be compensated for the value that they give to the company. They also want to feel like they're a part of the company. If we took that value conversation to a larger sense, everyone wants to belong. When we talk about bullying, when we talk about all of these social issues that children and young people go through, they go through those things because they're not valued by their peers. They're not communicating well with those people who are in the same space and place that they are. So employees really want to belong, and that belonging is demonstrated through employers demonstrating, and not just talk, but demonstrating to employees that they belong to something. They're a part of the mission. They're a part of the vision. They're a part of the engagement activities that organization does to help employees reap benefits beyond financial compensation into successful delivery of whatever the product or processes are in that organization. Conversely, employers must begin to, they have to engage employees, but they have to engage employees in a different way. Performance management changes have to change. Expectation measures have to change. The way we measure performance has to change. But first of all, it's got to be engagement. And that engagement has to come from the leader. That engagement is how a leader interacts with a follower. Fred Dansereau stated many years ago that what this dyadic treatment does is it creates an in-group and an out-group. Well, since we know that that's something that is a derivative based on his research, perhaps leaders or employers need to engage at a level where they have a consummate relationship with each one of their employees in a way that they don't feel that they're in the out group or they don't create an out group. And it's through that engagement, it's through those enhancing those performance measures and changing the expectations and measures that employers will be able to move forward and engage employees in the future.
I guess, like in my mind, I can see, different ways that could be done. I think for me, the thing, just from working for a number of companies in the past, I've always found that sometimes, people in the leadership team, and I unfortunately saw this personally as being sometimes part of that leadership team, that even after telling someone that you had to make the employees feel engaged or that essentially some relatable. That leadership still struggled to be able to do that because they still didn't understand. Do you have like specific examples that you could give, like how real leadership looks in an organization?
Sure. We have all heard about the new leader. I'll mention Tony Heisch. I'll mention some of those folks who have given part of their multi-million-dollar salary back to their staff, back to their employees. And those companies, and I'm speaking specifically about Zappos, have demonstrated that not only is it possible for a leader to reach employees, to share with employees, but it's also possible for a leader to demonstrate to employees that their performance, their engagement, their contribution to the bottom line is not only going to be appreciated with a nice little gift, but that you're going to become a part of the company. You will get profit sharing. You will do as well as we do. In the age of CEOs generating profit for organizations at the expense of employees. And a specific example of that would be Circuit City in several years ago. The CEO basically ran the company bankrupt because he was out to generate profit. You see, his profit or his multi-million-dollar profit was based on performance. Well, that performance meant I need to spend less in terms of my expenses and continue to sell. So what he did is he decided that he would replace all of the people who were responsible for that selling. He would replace an entire group of people, approximately 2,500 people, who were well paid because they were working on commission, but those were the people who kept that organization going. He replaced them with 2,500 new employees who had no experience, but he didn't have to pay them any money. He didn't even pay them minimum wage.
Oh my!
What was that?
I said, "Oh my gosh!"
Oh yeah, and what makes it
Wow.
More poignant is that not only did he drive the company into bankruptcy, but he also took the $25 million bonus because he showed on the books. He showed that he generated a profit simply by cutting expenses because he got rid of those people who were generating the income for the company. So all of that revenue that he showed was generated by those people whose jobs he cut. And he replaced them with people who could not perform at that level. And in 2 to 3 years, Circuit City was bankrupt.
That's horrible.
Well, it is horrible. And I think a lot of people look at it that way. I try to look at it a little bit differently. We have to understand that real leadership is a motivational function. It's not a position. It's not a driving force. It's a motivational force. What gets you up in the morning? What makes you want to go to work? What engages you in the job that you've chosen to do? So if a leader were to look at his or her role in that light, it would have been impossible for them to, if they looked at what was actually driving the revenue of the company, it would have been impossible for many leaders to look at that and say, I can get rid of this group of people who are generating this amount of income because maybe I won't make my $25 million bonus, but the company will be around 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now, as opposed to looking at it and saying, I'm going to get my $25 million bonus, and I don't really care what happens to the company in 2 years.
Would you say that is leadership that's something that you learn or something that you're born with?
It's both. It's a really interesting question, Anne-Marie, because so many people, especially when you sit down with a group of leaders who are potentially going to employ you. And what I mean by employ you is they're going to engage in your consulting activities. Many people in that room believe that they're born leaders.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they're born because their fathers were leaders, their mothers were leaders. They were raised in a family full of leaders. So they should be leaders. And then you have those people, Colin Powell, prime example, who comes from a very humble beginning and raises himself to a very high level. He was not born a leader. He had a stutter. He didn't even believe he could be a leader, but he became a leader. So there is no answer to that. That's a very chicken and egg sort of conversation, because what drives one person may not drive another. It's the motivation that an individual has to achieve success that identifies who the best leaders are. Because the best leaders will recognize that I need to adapt. In order to overcome, I need to adapt. If it means that I engage my employees, that's what I have to do. I can't sit in my catbird seat up on top of the mountain and watch everybody work. I have to get down there with the people, help them, give them motivation, show them where we're going, because it's that vision. Leadership has to provide that vision. But it's also an engagement, because you have to put yourself where the people are and let them know that they're a part of you and you're a part of them.
I guess you think that we got to this kind of, what is it? I'm looking for a different word. I want to say kind of a distance, or where people kind of a classism in leadership. I guess, did we get here? Do you think just because of where society was going, or have people have always seen themselves as like leaders, people who are leading or in one category, and then everybody else is workers? I guess what makes us in this society have that mentality?
Well, there are many things that have led us to where we are. And in order to understand where we are, we could probably take a short trip back to the beginning, when in the early instances of man and civilization, we were hunter-gatherers, and we realized that only the biggest, the strongest, the fastest, the smartest could outwit the animals, or could bring food home, or could figure out ways to acquire goods. Well, those people became leaders, and they became leaders based on their individual qualities and characteristics. We've carried that forward through many, many, many generations, and we still have people who live off the actual accomplishments of people who are no longer alive. So a good example in our current society is that movie stars or celebrities or musicians all have the expectation that their children will be movie stars or celebrities or musicians. when in fact they may not have that talent at all. And I think that it's very difficult for a child, and we can see that in the exacerbation of some of the things that happen to the children of celebrities. Very few of them are as successful as their parents, and that creates another disconnect, because the expectation is that they will be. They have it in their blood, when in fact there is no blood. There is no leadership blood that passes through from one to the other. And without being repetitious, I just want to say that every individual must be motivated, and they must be motivated to the point that they are willing to put themselves out there to make a change. From a social standpoint, from a professional standpoint, and from an environmental standpoint.
Yes, I'm glad that you brought up the environmental standpoint. As we head closer and closer to 2030, I feel like we're in one of those sand timers.
Yeah.
Now, turning a little more, now that more and more that we're heading into remote work, do you think that leadership is becoming more or less important?
I don't know that leadership is more or less important. I think that leadership is another change that must occur. Because one of the things that we have to understand is, what do leaders do? What do leaders do? What is leadership for? Leaderships are there to provide vision. In other words, every person who is a leader is not necessarily someone who has a vision. However, that vision for every organization should come from its leadership. Now, that creates some very difficult circumstances for a lot of people. If you took over your father or your mother's business, would you have the same vision that your mother or father had when they started that business? There's no right or wrong answer to that, but there is a situation where we have to examine the motivational basis that everyone has for being a leader. And I hate to keep saying this over and over again, but I really think it's important, and it's something that I emphasize when I speak with clients and when I speak with students. If we don't understand our motivations, if we don't understand what makes us go, we can't share that motivation, and we can't inspire or create a vision that we can share with our employees, or that we can share with the general public to entice them to participate in whatever it is we happen to be buying or selling.
Yes. So then, this is just my conclusion. Do you think that a leadership problems are because there's a lot of people who don't have a lot of vision?
I think that as a whole, there are many, many instances in our society and globally, actually, where there are people who have vision, and those who don't have vision, how can I say this? They choose not to participate because they can't be equal. Does that make sense? They choose not to exhibit vision or place vision in a position where it's a driver because they don't have it.
Right.
So I don't know that there is a way to give someone a vision. If you don't have it in you, no one can put it in you. Does that make sense? They can't give it to you. You can't buy it or sell it. You have to know it. A very good example of that is Elon Musk. Elon Musk is continuously driving himself. He's the richest man in the world. Well, as of last week, I don't know if that's still true, but he's the richest man in the world, and he's still creating. He's still innovating. He's still coming up with new ideas. And I'm absolutely certain that as you and I speak here today, there are ideas that he had. There are things that have motivated him to make another change or jump to the next project because he's motivated to continue his path. His journey doesn't end with an electric vehicle. His journey doesn't end with a hyperloop. His journey doesn't end with a trip to outer space. There are things in the pipeline right now. We're talking about batteries for EVs. He's trying to revolutionize batteries. Those things have not come to fruition yet, but he continually presents a vision of the future that indicates that he will continue to operate at a very high level. There are others, many others, who practice the same thing. Warren Buffett is a very good example of someone from the old school who is continually looking at ways to make life better, not only for himself, but for those people who are interested in listening to his predilections, his prognostications. Those are all the types of things that I think we have to look for in our leaders. And the number one thing, and I hope that this part is really evident, we must ensure that leaders have integrity. Mm-hmm. Without integrity, none of the things that we talk about really matter. If you have someone in a position of power, in a position of authority, or a leader who does not have integrity, you have no way to predict what will come in the future. Because if they're willing to do anything, they will do anything. And that anything will mean disaster to a bunch of people. And I'm not talking about any particular one, but it's something that we really need to understand. And there is no gaining your integrity back once you've lost it. It's not a book. You can't get it back from the library. It's gone. And you really need to make some sincere effort to make sure that you don't lose it.
That one is a good one. That is something I think I have actually haven't heard very often from people, is that once you lose your integrity, you cannot get it back.
Well, I have one more for you, Anne-Marie, that I think I would love for the general public to hear, and it's something that I say quite often to my students. I heard this a number of years ago from a nurse leader that I worked with back in San Diego, and she got it from another professor that she worked with who was actually a healthcare administrator. And it goes like this. We must all be careful of the problems that we create from our solutions. So we can't just say, oh my goodness, I know the answer to this, until we've thought through things to the point that we can see the future. We can see what the outcome is. Because without seeing that, we may, in fact, be creating even bigger problems.
Wow. Yes, you've hit on some seriously core things that I think that people try to, in general, brush over in the society. A vision is extremely important, and there are very few people that have real visions. And integrity, I think, especially in these times, across the whole entire world, integrity is definitely in trouble. I always say integrity and responsibility. People hate to use the word responsibility these days.
Absolutely.
So yes, and then being able to think before jumping and think about others. Essentially, this is the well, it's more than the golden rule. I was going to say the golden rule, but it's more than the golden rule.
It's the platinum rule.
Yes, yes. This is important for people to hear, not only because of the fact that we are now in this remote environment, but we're up against something that's coming up greater than the pandemic. So we really need to think.
We need to think, and our leaders need to think. I'm always reluctant to use that word because there are so few of them out there. However, we have people that we placed in positions of authority. And whether we choose to call them leaders or not is, it's up to us individually. But we have placed people in positions of authority. And those are the people that I cry out to. Those are the people that I want to meet with. Those are the individuals. I don't meet with a department in a hospital or in a healthcare setting. I want to meet with the CEO and the executive team. Those are the people who are setting the strategic vision. Those are the people who are sitting down and deciding, well, this is our mission statement and this is our vision statement, and it aligns with our strategy. Because there is nothing wrong with making money. Conscious capitalism has demonstrated that whether we're in a remote environment or we're in an on-ground environment, we can make money and still be decent. We can make money and still take care of each other. Those companies, Starbucks, Walmart, a few of those, Amazon, they practice conscious capitalism. And for those interested in understanding what conscious capitalism is, I'll be posting an article on my website soon. But I hope that this podcast will get people thinking about what is it we need to do to change the course of where we're headed. Because it's not where we are, it's where we're headed.
Yes, we're in the danger zone. I'm thinking that because of there's so much, I guess there's so many directions that leaders are trying to, or people who are put in leadership positions are trying to push in society. And what I mean by that is that, especially during these times, people want to talk about, we're going to be, we focus on mental health. We let people have a week off to, recover. Let's see. I don't know. I'm making this one up. We're doing something nice for your kids. So there's a lot of people trying to show leadership by doing these nice gestures. I guess overall, do you see those as being effective, or are they just nice deeds?
I think that we have to look at human civilization in a whole sense. In other words, there is nothing that a drop of water won't change. It's tiny. It's just a drop. These gestures are tiny, but they make a difference. They make a difference to someone. They make a difference to some event. They make a difference to something that will affect someone. So each and every instance of kindness that we can generate and share can't do anything but help us. It can't do anything but make us better. It can't do anything but better our society.
That's a good way to look at it, because I've had people that I've talked to look at it either of like it's not enough or that's great. So I love your perspectives.
Well, I'd like to challenge those folks to tell me what is enough. And if you can tell me what is enough, where do you start? If you don't start with the smallest inkling of something, it means you haven't started. So until you start, you can't go anywhere. You're still in the same place.
Now, this issue, I'm just going to touch on it briefly just because I'm bringing it up because it is another hot topic that's out there. Is that in this new remote working world, of course, there's always groups that are at disadvantaged. Do you think that now that we're doing more work remotely and things remotely, do you think this will be offer kind of a safety haven for those that deal with gender issues or racial issues?
It's funny that you mentioned that, because I was reading something several weeks ago about the impacts of work from home statistics on other people, and I call others people who are not work from home or remote employees. So in that, there is a breakdown of diversity changes. And it does not appear from the research that I'm finding, basically this is from Statistica, it does not appear that hybrid work has changed any of the diverse components or diversity components in our workforce. It would seem that if all things were equal, that would be the case. But it just doesn't appear that we see those changes happening, at least not yet. I firmly believe that over time, people will become more enamored with work from home, with telecommuting. And as we can see now, there are only 5.7 million employees in the United States workforce that telecommuted for half time. Now, 5.7 million out of 300 million is not a lot. That's less than 4.2%. But what does that mean in terms of how it's broken out from a diversity standpoint? We have to focus more energy on reaching those diverse elements of our society and ensuring that they're a part of this change. Now, whether or not they have the skills is a question, whether or not they have the desire, whether or not they have the expertise that's required to do this type of work. Those are other questions that face us and sort of break out again over the issues of diversity or the issues of being more inclusive. And I think that without facing them, we have to understand that bias it exists everywhere. So it doesn't matter if you like Cheerios or Honey Bunches of Oats. Every time you make a choice, every time you make a decision, it's based on some type of bias. So we can't take bias and say, well, you're a racist, so you're biased, or you're prejudiced against this group, or you treat this group differently because you're biased. That's not bias. That's racism or sexism or genderism. Bias is something that we all experience. Bias is something that we all need to understand more of, because there's a difference between bias and racism. There's a difference between bias and sexism. There's a difference between bias and genderism. So remote workers in this study actually stated that workplace hostility increased.
Wow.
Which, would just sound unreal. But with a lack of control, because now you don't have a supervisor, a manager, or a leader who's there to make sure that these things don't take place in the workplace. They're all happening in a remote environment. Without extensive cybersecurity, there's no way that a company can prevent them from happening. So just because someone has a bias doesn't mean they're racist. But just because a person is working from home doesn't mean that the environment is open to a diverse population. I hope that answers the question.
It did. I was hoping to see that it was either at a neutral state still. But I could see, I guess, that because you don't have someone actually there, and that people are in, a more enclosed or separated remote setting, doing a conference call or something of that sort, that you don't have, people to witness the different things that could be happening to you from like a microaggression or looks or something like that.
Yeah, unfortunately, you're absolutely on point. It's Trolls exist, and trolls were not a part of our society. They were not a part of our consciousness until the internet gave them the anonymity to be who they are, to be racist, to be sexist. They were given permission because of anonymity. That means that in a remote environment, without having the internet police, we are going to see those microaggressions. We're actually going to see aggression. The number of suicides has increased since we've moved to a more remote worker environment. Some people say it's due to isolation. Maybe isolation has something to do with it. But it could also be due to some of those aggressions and microaggressions, as you mentioned, that people are experiencing that they can't report. Because how can you prove it? If it had occurred in an environment where there is not appropriate cybersecurity, then the employee has no way to do it other than report. Excuse me. And in reporting, where's the proof? So we don't see those things manifesting in the on-ground environment as much, only because there's someone around who you can report to. It's human resources, it's your supervisor, your manager. There's another employee whose cubicle happens to be next to yours, or there's someone who hears you in the break room. There were more opportunities for people to feel safer when they were in an on-ground environment than there are for them to feel safe in an online or remote environment.
That's disappointing to hear. I was hoping that it would have improved. I did find that some of the biggest struggles that people, the number one struggle that people were having with remote work was that they couldn't unplug after work. Because they had, they were already home and they had been working, and sometimes it's hard to stop. And then the next, I'm just putting the top three, was the loneliness factor, because of course you're working alone. And then other people, I guess it's kind of going back to the classroom days, they miss talking to other people at the water cooler.
So it's very interesting that you say that, because in the Pew Research Center study, 25% of remote workers stated they were less satisfied with their jobs than they were pre-pandemic. And a lot of that, and some of the things that are playing a part in the big quit or the big resignation, are that people do miss those things that happen in an on-ground environment. They miss the camaraderie. We've had a number of television shows that are based on what happens at the office. We all know what the water cooler means. These are things that people are very familiar with. And losing those things often means that people lose their connectivity. And that connectivity is not a digital connectivity, but it's a people connectivity. So as we look through what happened with the pandemic, there was less to do with work than there was people just losing the connectivity they had to those people that they worked with. They knew who they could talk to, who they could have lunch with, who they could hang out with, who they could go to the water cooler with, and they felt comfortable and safe with that. They knew who not to do those things with. But now they don't know. They're in a digital environment where they're looking at a computer screen, and quite often they're playing video games on their computer because there's not enough cybersecurity provided by the employer. Or they're on Facebook or some other social media platform where no one has a way to monitor what they're doing. Why? Why would they be doing this if they're at work? Well, they're doing it because they're not engaged in the work. They're not a part of the organization. And it doesn't matter if they're in a remote environment or if they're on ground. If they're not engaged, and that is the leader's role, to provide a vision that engages employees in the company's strategic plan, you will have this type of a disconnect that continues whether we're remote or on ground.
So what would be your, I guess, give me 2 to 3 suggestions that a leader could, implement in a remote working or environment that might help engage employees?
Well, two things that I can think of right off the top of my head is leaders must learn engagement. Engagement is not a survey. Engagement is not getting your employees to answer questions. Engagement is about getting to know your employees. I want to take time out to mention a facility that I worked at, and I was so enamored at this leader because of one specific skill that he had. He has led probably 6 to 7, I call them mid to major healthcare organizations around the country over the past 20 years. But when I met him, I was very new to the organization. In fact, I had just moved back to California. And he met me at a leadership meeting. I had never met him. I was so new, I didn't even have a name badge on. But he walked up to me, he shook my hand, and he called me by my name. And I said, I'm doing well, thank you very much. And your name is, I looked at his name badge, and it was the CEO. He took the time to get to know every employee by photograph, by name, by past history, so that when he met them in their onboarding, they were immediately immersed into the organization because they were immersed in him. I went on to work with him for several years through several really large projects. We were able to get a bond passed by a city in California to build another hospital. So I think number one is leaders must learn ways to engage employees. The next is to change both the performance management expectation and the way we measure performance. Because if you understand what the expectations are when you take the job, and if you're highly motivated, your goal is to exceed those expectations if you're motivated. If you're not, you're in the wrong job, and it needs to be identified very quickly, and the organization needs to move on. That means that number 3, you need to have different performance management measures. You can't use a 1-year evaluation to tell you whether or not this employee is engaged and is actually operating at a level that's going to help your organization. You need to be able to tell that very quickly. And you also need to have policies in place that will allow you to move on if you have hired someone who's not engaged. If you've hired someone who wants to take up a seat, it's time to move on. So changing performance management measures, changing performance managers' expectation, and learning new ways of engaging leadership to employer or leadership to follower are 3 of the top skills that I think, tools that I think activities that need to occur in organizations as we move forward, specifically in a remote working environment.
Those are good pointers that should help some people out there that are trying to make this switch. I
hope so.
I think it's very helpful. So I've learned a lot. So since we've learned a little bit about what from an employee perspective, from an employer perspective, and we've looked out just remote work in general, and what in general people would like, and how people are moving forward to more and more remote work. I'm going to ask you two more questions. One is, I guess, what do you envision the future of work to look like, Ike?
The future of work is as difficult to predict as it is simple to predict. Work will happen. Number one, work will happen. The question is, what type of work is it? As we continue to progress into a more and more digital environment, will people manage machines, or will machines manage people? Will AI replace human thought, or will humans maintain control over human thought? There are many things that we can do, but one of the things that we need to all go back to is to understand what is normal. I'm often struck by the migration of salmon from the sea back to their spawning grounds. These fish swim upstream for miles and miles against the current. They jump gigantic reefs of water, rocks, all to get back to where they've been so that they can give birth to the next generation. You can spend a lot of time exerting energy to adapt to the old, and not enough time exerting energy to create the new. More than likely, what we will see in the future and what we will see in the new normal, we will keep a part of the past. But we need to change our work environment, whether it's remote, on ground, or something that we don't even know yet. We need to maintain something of what we had. The only reason for salmon to swim upstream to spawn is that they go back to something that is familiar. And I believe that we, as humans involved in a workforce, need to make sure that we're holding on to what is valuable to us, what is viable, and what is necessary.
Mm-hmm. Well put. So, in conclusion, what is something about leadership that most people don't know?
Something about leadership that most people don't know? I think I've touched on it before. Leadership comes from motivation. It doesn't come from training. It doesn't necessarily come from being given the reins to a company. It certainly doesn't come from birth. Leadership comes from being motivated to get something done. Whether we look at Sir Richard Branson, Jeff Bezos, or Elon Musk, they all want to get something done. They want to create the next big thing. That next big thing happens to be outer space. They don't want to just fly people around in the upper atmosphere a few miles above the Earth. They want to demonstrate and prove that normal people can travel beyond the Earth's bounds and still be fine. That is understanding how to create a vision. So neither one of those people were born into leadership. Did they become leaders? Yes. Yes, they did. Each one is different. But they all have one thing in common, and that is the motivation to achieve success. So, to wrap up, I think that the one thing most people don't know about leadership and leaders is that motivation plays a much larger role in the success of a leader and the leadership that leader exhibits on their organization, whether remote or otherwise.
Fantastic. I love it. Thank you, Dr. Cooper, for your time and insight. If people would like to know more about you, where should they reach you?
They can reach me on my LinkedIn profile. That's one place. They can also go to www.leadershipmattersmore.com, or they can simply reach out to me at Grand Canyon University. That's henry.cooper at my.gcu.edu.
Okay.
And I really want to take this opportunity to thank you for inviting me. I am just thrilled to get this opportunity, and I hope that we have an opportunity to speak again soon.
If you have a passion for an unserved community, a social justice problem, or simply want to change minds, contact Project Good Work at projectgood.work to start your project of change today. To our listeners, thanks for tuning in to Project Good, where we are focused on what matters.